Mattei and Streetman show. As promised, we have a very special guest joining us, an international guest, and he's written a book. A lot to say about this author.
Oh, yeah. Well, he is a very well-known Catholic historian. He's written over 35 books. He served as the vice president for almost a decade of the National Research Council in Italy, which is the highest-ranking scientific institution in Italy. Having just finished his book, St. Pius V, I can tell you he is a very, very erudite scholar. He has a lot of detail. It's a fascinating book. Just came out. I highly recommend it. Welcome to the program, Professor De Mattei.
Thank you. I'm here. Thank you.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit, just give us an overview of your new book, St. Pius V.
Yes, my book is dedicated to this great pontiff. I think that is very important today to have a positive, a good model, because sometimes we criticize rightly popes or bishops, but we need also to have a positive model. So Pius V seems to me one of the most current popes for his holiness in governing the church and for the richness of his teaching.
So, Professor, you've explained it a little bit, but if you could elaborate on what made him, Pope Pius V, such a worthy subject in church history. You're a renowned Catholic historian. You've written over 35 books, so much material. What drew you to him specifically?
I'm interested above all on history of religious events. I mean the history of the church. Above all, concerning the relationship between the church and the secular world. And I think that what is interesting, perhaps, in my books is the fact that Pius V fought a battle against internal and external enemies of the church. And today we fight perhaps the same battle, the same struggle against external and internal enemies of the church. So from this point of view, also, Pope Pius V could be considered a model.
Well, it's a fascinating story. I noticed you mentioned earlier, his holiness and, his religiosity, essentially, that he was a very dedicated, holy man who lived a very, very good life. And I think your book was very fair in discussing, some of the popes that had come before, particularly during the medieval period, where there were some, particularly negative stories about some of the pontiffs during that period. And, he really wanted to restore the dignity and overcome some of those negative stories that some of us have heard, and I know you're familiar with because you've studied all of this. But I found it fascinating when reading your book, this concept of just to think it was only a few hundred years ago that Protestants and Catholics were essentially mortal enemies. That's very different, I think, than what we see in our world today. I know there are theological disagreements, but back then, we had assassinations, we had wars, we had people wanting to kill each other over religious doctrine issues. And I just find that really fascinating. What do you think? Give us some concept of the mindset of Pope Pius V, because he was an inquisitor, and he wanted to stamp out what he viewed as heresies that were coming from Protestantism. But give us some of the mindset of this idea that you would actually, potentially engage in committing bloodshed versus just arguing with people with words.
Yes. Christianity at the time of Pope Pius V had three kinds of enemies. External enemies which was Islam as today. But also internal enemies of the Western society, of the Christendom. One of these enemy was the Protestant Revolution. Today, Protestantism is no more an enemy of the church. But at that time, we have to remember that until the 16th century, Christendom was united, and the Protestant Revolution represented a fracture, a division inside the Christianity, inside the Christendom, and so in Pius V fought. Also from a military point of view against Protestantism, but also he was not the founder, but perhaps the most important representative in his century of the Inquisition. The Inquisition is an ecclesiastical tribunal that still exists today under the name of Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And the existence of this tribunal is a consequence of the nature of the church, which is not only an invisible mystical body, but it is also a visible society. And the Inquisition was created to identify heresy. And at that time, heresy was above all Protestant heresy. And so the role of Pius V was really very, very, very interesting, very important. I remember that on his tomb in Santa Maria Maggiore, where he's buried, Pius V, there was an important monument, and we can admire at the right of the monument the image of Pius V, who gives the banner to Don Juan d'Austria, the winner of the Battle of Lepanto. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, there is the image of Pius V, who gives a standard, a banner to the chief, to the commander of the pontifical army, who fought against the Protestants, against the Huguenots, Protestant in France. It's very interesting that the sepulchre, the tomb of Pius V remembers this militant attitude of the Saint Pope.
Well, that is very interesting because, and I picked up on that theme in your book, the militancy of the church and the concept of the church militant, which is something I'm actually not familiar with. But in those days, and maybe even today, and you could probably clarify this for us, there was the sense that essentially the church is engaged in not necessarily warfare in the way that we might think of warfare, but spiritual warfare throughout the world. Yes. As it fights against the forces of darkness. Tell us a little about that.
Yes, the church has never professed pacifism. In the three first centuries of the church, Christians were faithful soldiers of the Roman Empire. They refused to sacrifice to idols, but they didn't refuse military service. They were brave and loyal soldiers. And Saint Pius V instilled this militant spirit in the Christian army that fought and won at Lepanto. And this spirit belongs to us. Today, of course, as you say, Lepanto is not the banner of an armed war, but it is the symbol of an attitude of spirit. And this militant spirit is a fruit of the blood shed by our Lord Jesus Christ on Calvary.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, we've got so much more we want to get into with you. We hear the music, so we're going to have to take a short break very quickly. But when we come back, we want to talk to you about the Holy League that was created around that time, the invasions of the Ottoman Turks. They had just taken the city of Constantinople in 1453, the last day of the world, as it's called by Greek Orthodox folks, still to this day. And then subsequent to that, as you mentioned, the Battle of Lepanto, which happened in the late 1500s, which is a fascinating naval battle. And I want you to tell us all about that. So we're going to get into that and some about the Lepanto Foundation, of which you're the president, when we come back on The Morgan Streetman Show. Thank you for listening to The Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard. And if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.